Janet Yellen in her office on Tuesday. Lexey Swall for The New York Times. By most conventional measures, Janet Yellen's 4 years as the nation's top economic policymaker have been a success. Unemployment fell steadily during her term, inflation stayed in check, and the Fed began backing gradually away from the extraordinary steps it took in the wake of the financial crisis. That wasn't enough to save her job, however. President Trump nominated Jerome H. Powell to be chairman of the Federal Reserve, which means that Ms. Yellen will be the first person in nearly 40 years to serve no more than a single 4-year term as head of the central bank. Ms. Yellen, who was serving as the Fed's vice chairwoman at the time of her appointment, was not the only person considered for the top job. President Barack Obama considered naming former Treasury Secretary Lawrence H. Summers to the post. Once Mr. Obama did nominate her, Ms. Yellen was confirmed on an unusually partisan 5,626 vote in the Senate. And once in office, Ms. Yellen continued to stir strong feelings. Republicans in Congress and on the campaign trail accused the Fed under her leadership of imposing burdensome regulations on the financial industry, a complaint that may have contributed directly to Mr. Trump's decision not to reappoint her. Here is a closer look at Ms. Yellen's complex legacy. Since the late 1970s, the Fed has had a dual mandate of promoting maximum employment and stable prices. By one set of measures, Ms. Yellen's tenure was a clear success on both counts. Unemployment is at its lowest level since 2001. And the Fed's preferred measure of inflation has generally stayed well below its 2% target. Feb. 2014 when Ms. Yellen took office. Sept. 2017 lowest level since 2001. Feb. 2014 when Ms. Yellen took office. Sept. 2017 lowest level since 2001. Note: inflation is measured as annual change in personal consumption expenditure price index. Source: Bureau of Labor Statistics and Bureau of Economic Analysis. Via Fred. The simple message is the economy is doing well. We have confidence in the robustness of the economy and its resilience to shocks. It's performed well over the last several years. Other measures paint a more ambiguous picture, however. The share of working-age Americans who have jobs, a more comprehensive measure than the unemployment rate, remains below its pre-recession level, and wage growth has been slow for much of Ms. Yellen's term. Both trends suggest that the Fed is still falling short of its maximum employment mandate. The gap between the haves and have-nots hasn't closed in recent years. It still remains a gulf. The low rate of inflation has also led many liberal economists to suggest that the Fed could have done more to bolster the economy without running the risk of runaway price increases. Ms. Yellen described persistently low inflation as a concern in a news conference in September. Note: GDP figures are for the fourth quarter of each year. Source: Federal Reserve. Under Ms. Yellen, as under her predecessor, Ben Bernanke, a stronger economic recovery was always just around the corner. In March 2014, shortly after Ms. Yellen took over, Fed policymakers said they expected gross domestic product to grow at about a 3% rate each year through 2016. That proved overly optimistic. In 2016, economic growth by the Fed's measure didn't even reach 2%. Even with the U.S. Federal Reserve's aggressive monetary policies, the recovery both in the United States and around the globe has fallen significantly short of predictions and has been far weaker than its predecessors. It isn't clear what's behind those repeated disappointments, or how much Ms. Yellen or the Fed are to blame. Slow growth has been a problem across the developed world in recent years, and the United States has in fact outperformed many of its international peers. Some economists have pointed at demographics, globalization or other forces outside policymakers' control. But to the extent Ms. Yellen's policies were driven by her assessment of the strength of the economy, those assessments proved consistently too rosy. For the last 5 or 6 years, the Federal Reserve keeps predicting inflation is around the corner. And those predictions end up being wrong. When Ms. Yellen became chairwoman in February 2014, the Fed had held interest rates near zero for more than 5 years in an effort to revive the economy. With unemployment falling and inflation edging upward, she came under almost immediate pressure to raise rates. Instead, she waited nearly 2 years, until December 2015, to do so, then another full year before doing so again. The Fed has now approved 4 quarter-point rate increases under Ms. Yellen, and is widely expected to raise rates again in December. The federal funds target rate. A federal funds target rate node chart shows upper limit of Fed funds target range. Source: Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Ms. Yellen's caution drew fire from inflation hawks, and she faced dissent within the Fed as well. 3 members of the Fed's policy-making open market committee voted against the decision to leave rates steady at the committee's September 2016 meeting. But Ms. Yellen also faced criticism from the left. In 2015, Ms. Yellen's former rival for the Fed's top job, Mr. Summers, argued in a commentary in the Financial Times that the Fed was making a serious error by raising rates too soon. Total assets held by the Federal Reserve mortgage-backed securities. Total assets held by the Federal Reserve mortgage-backed securities. Total assets held by the Federal Reserve mortgage-backed securities. The Fed did much more than just cut interest rates in response to the 2008 financial crisis. It also embarked on a series of unusual or unprecedented steps, bailing out banks, buying up troubled mortgages, and, later, injecting trillions of dollars directly into the economy through successive rounds of bond buying known as quantitative easing. Those efforts, which Ms. Yellen helped guide as a member and later vice chairwoman of the Open Market Committee, were winding down by the time she took over as Fed chief, leaving her with a different challenge: what to do about the Fed's more than $4 trillion balance sheet. For most of Ms. Yellen's tenure, her answer was nothing. The Fed bought new bonds to replace ones that were maturing, keeping its total holdings essentially flat. But in September, the bank said it would begin gradually paring its holdings by allowing some bonds to roll off its balance sheet. "We are working down our balance sheet because we feel that's stimulus that in some sense is no longer needed. So the basic message here is, U.S. economic performance has been good." The unanimous decision was widely seen as a vote of confidence in the health of the United States economy. It will be months before it is clear whether that confidence was well placed. Source: Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Believe me, we're in a bubble right now. And the only thing that looks good is the stock market. But if you raise interest rates even a little bit, that's going to come crashing down. A Federal Reserve chief's every utterance can move global financial markets. Ms. Yellen's utterances, more often than not, moved them up. The Standard & Poor's 500 stock index, the broadest measure of American stock market performance, is up by nearly half since Ms. Yellen took office, and the more technology-centric Nasdaq Composite is up by 2/3. Riskier assets have seen even bigger gains. Those big gains have been good news for investors, including workers trying to rebuild their retirement savings after the 2008 financial crisis. But they have led to fears among some market analysts that the Fed could be artificially propping up the market by encouraging investors to take bigger risks in search of higher returns, perhaps inflating a bubble that will pop as the Fed begins raising rates and reducing its bond holdings. Ms. Yellen herself has hinted that asset prices may be too high, although she has also expressed confidence that the financial system is strong enough to withstand a drop in prices. President Trump during last year's campaign called the market gains a big, fat, ugly bubble, but more recently praised them as evidence that his economic policies are working. Ms. Yellen in March. Al Drago for the New York Times. Already, for some, memories of this experience may be fading, memories of just how costly the financial crisis was and of why certain steps were taken in response. As the first post-financial crisis head of the Fed, Ms. Yellen had the task of putting in place new rules that greatly expanded the central bank's role in regulating the financial industry. Ms. Yellen left much of that work to another Fed board member, Daniel K. Tarullo, who resigned earlier this year, and to Stanley Fischer, the Fed's vice chairman, who stepped down in October. In recent months, however, Ms. Yellen has become more vocal about the need for financial regulation. In a speech in Wyoming in August, she warned against forgetting the lessons of the financial crisis, and said the Fed's policies, which have included subjecting big banks to strict stress tests that evaluate how well they could weather another crisis, had made the financial system safer. Those views aren't popular among Republicans in Congress or in the White House. Mr. Trump has criticized financial regulation as stifling lending and economic growth, and he nominated Randall K. Quarles, an outspoken critic of post-crisis regulations, to lead the Fed's regulatory efforts.